Okay, this presentation is about gifted and talented as an exceptionality and how that can affect teachers and the accommodations that they choose for their students. So to start off, we need to talk about IDEA and how this is covered under it. And the short version of that story is that it's not covered under IDEA. The responsibilities of schools concerning gifted and talented students um, were first outlined in 1988 and kind of folded into the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. And I have quoted here how that act defined gifted students who give evidence of high achievement capability in areas such as intellectual, creative, artistic, or leadership capacity, or in specific academic fields, and who need services and activities not ordinarily provided by the school to develop in those capabilities. So that means that students can be classified as gifted and talented as having high achievement and capability in all of those areas or even just one. But the law doesn't provide any specifications on that criteria. It only provides the definition. That means that states are left to interpret the definition on their own and specify how a child might qualify for gifted and talented services. And so you're going to see it vary from state to state. Characteristics of students with gifted and talented exceptionalities are about as varied as you can get. So students might show all of these characteristics, they might show none of them, but these are some common ones that you'll see. Sometimes they learn, apply, and remember information very quickly or more easily than their peers. But there can, however, be a limit to the area that they show these abilities. So it might just be in a single subject or area of talent, or it might be in all areas. The students tend to think about information on a larger scale, more systematically, or even abstractly than their peers. They can exhibit stronger problem-solving skills. Sometimes they have very high energy levels that can bring in sometimes other exceptionalities as well. And they might be students with behavior problems. They might be classified as the students who dominate discussions, which can often be looked at as kind of a bad thing. But oftentimes it's just because they feel like they have a good amount of knowledge on the subject. And they can often get bored and frustrated after completing assigned work easily. I did list some sub-bullets here that boredom and frustration can damage their self-esteem and lower their motivation, which can in turn cause them to not be identified and just kind of exacerbates the problem. It can also lead to poor behavior choices. So it is important with this exception, just as with the others, to try and catch it early and find ways to help these students. It's really hard to nail down prevalence of gifted and talented students just because of how the definition can vary from state to state, and there's a lot of other factors involved, so I kind of wanted to cover those. There were approximately 3.2 million students enrolled in gifted and talented programs in public schools through the 2011-2012 school year. I couldn't find any more up-to-date information than that. However, back in the 70s, there were estimates that 5 to 7% of students were capable of high performance. So it is very possible that that 3.2 million is a little bit low and not accurate. The type of giftedness and the definition can affect numbers, which can affect identification. So whether or not students are gifted in just one area or in all areas can affect whether or not we identify them, and the differences in that definition to state can affect that. Our biases on socioeconomics can also affect identification, depending on the school, the teacher, and the biases that might be involved and where that student might live and the background they come from. We might not identify them. And oftentimes identification is affected if students have other exceptionalities that kind of mask those traits that we talked about on the previous page. So it's important to not have bias when it comes to exceptionalities as well. What causes gifted and talented students is there's a lot of research into it, but it's not exactly conclusive. But it seems to be interactions between both genetics and the environment that that student grows up in. So it has been identified that functions in gifted and talented students' brain have accelerated development, and that makes brain functioning more efficient and effective. But that can be in just minute areas such as musicality or creativity, or it can be in kind of widespread areas, working with reasoning or reading, analytical processing. So all different areas can have these effects, and it doesn't have to be widespread. The environmental factors that are included and affect how a student's genetics kind of affect their exceptionality include achievement expectations from not only parents, but also educators and role models in their communities, teaching and modeling strategies for responsibility and self-control, which again can start really young with parental supervision, but also goes and moves on into the school and their different activities that they are involved in outside of the school, but in their communities. Providing language opportunities of various forms, such as musicality, reading, being read to, listening, even movies, different cultures, all of those things when it comes to language can help students in their development. Play that is challenging and flexible, again, starting off at home, especially before those students start getting into the school system, and then continuing throughout school. And engaging in conversation and encouraging discussion. And one thing that the research did note was that conversation and discussion is really going to affect these students when they're at home before they start developing into their kindergarten stages and preschool stages. So that was one that they really identified as being a home factor and a community factor. So how do we approach accommodations for these students? There are two main ways that we can appropriately pitch challenge to foster these students' abilities. And the first one is going to be acceleration. And this is where students are able to move through coursework faster. You can do that in different ways. You might, as a teacher, decide to present the material quicker for those students to allow them to maybe go deeper or move on to other subjects or other content. And it can be a school decision combined with parents in allowing those students to skip grades or move classes after they've mastered them. The other available option is enrichment, which is expanding the depth of attention that is required for the subject that you're teaching. And you can do this by having students investigate content at a deeper level than other students might in your room, or providing them extra learning opportunities. All of these things are used. They all have different pros and cons, but they're all just some options that you might think about. Some other accommodation strategies would be compacting, which is where you take your curriculum and you don't do any repetition from like previous years or previous subjects and content areas, just so that the students who have already mastered that material don't have to sit through and be bored. And obviously you might not want to do that for all your students, but it really helps out the students with the gifted and talented exceptionality. Grouping, which is highly controversial, but allowing gifted students to work with other gifted students allows for appropriate depth of knowledge. You might not want to do it at all the time, all the times they do group work, but it definitely helps students to work with students who are kind of at the same level of them as them. And the last thing here is don't overdo specialization. So as I talked about earlier, these students might have higher development in different areas, where they might have high development in all areas. And because we don't know that information necessarily, you don't want them to focus just on an area that they're gifted and talented at. You want them to develop in all areas when it comes to knowledge and skills. I did want to provide some examples of specific things that you can do in your classroom. One of these is reference framing. The good thing about reference framing is it can be culturally reflective. It allows students to go through deeper learning, and it can be cross-cutting concerning content. So what reference framing is when you've had a student who masters material or masters the content that you're teaching. So you ask them to look at that content through the eyes or perspective of someone or something else. And I have a few examples here. So one is after you've learned about like Lewis and Clark and westward expansion, you might have a student who's mastered that content dig in that content through the perspective of Native Americans or people who are already here. In math, you could take skills and content that you've learned, like different equations and different processes, and have students find ways that they can use that in real life, whether it be in a specific career such as engineering or space, or just in their everyday life as they see themselves in the future. And another one, when you're studying science and ecology, you might be looking at the ecology that a tree provides for the animals and plants around it. And you can, after a student's mastered that content, have them look at that tree through the eyes of a poet, getting in some cross-cutting content there with reading and writing, through the eyes of a nesting bird, which would just be like a different perspective in science, or through the eyes of a land developer. So that's one way that you can provide accommodations for students, is by having them use reference framing. And another one is doing questioning. The way that you go about inquiry with these students can really help them develop and keep them from being bored. It can challenge them. So you can consider doing these different types of questioning on their assignments, in their worksheets, or even in one-on-one discussion. I've provided a few organizations for more information. The first is Kansas Association for Gifted, Talented, and Creative. I know other states also have this. I just included that one because I'm from Kansas, and I was one of these students and had a pretty good experience. So I think that the Kansas Association is pretty well developed. And then the National Association for Gifted Children as well. Thanks for tuning in to my presentation, guys.